The rhythmic sound of a cane tapping against the sidewalk echoed through the quiet morning streets of Brooklyn. The city was just beginning to stir, with the aroma of fresh coffee wafting from nearby cafes and the distant hum of traffic growing steadily louder. Among the early risers was Daniel Carter, a man whose once brilliant world had been plunged into perpetual darkness. Daniel had not always been blind. Just 3 years ago, he had been a talented architect, known for his visionary designs and meticulous attention to detail. His life had been a masterpiece in the making, an engagement to his longtime love, Rachel Dawson, a career on the rise, and a future filled with endless possibilities. But fate had other plans. It had been a rainy evening, the kind where headlights blurred into streaks on the wet pavement. Daniel and Rachel were returning from a late-night dinner, laughter still lingering in the car. They never saw the speeding truck coming. The impact was sudden, violent, a screech of metal, shattering glass, and then silence. When Daniel awoke in the hospital days later, the world had changed. His head throbbed, his body ached, but the true horror settled in when he realized he could not see. Doctors explained that the trauma had caused optic nerve damage, rendering him permanently blind. But the greater pain came when he asked about Rachel. She hadn't survived. The weight of her absence crushed him more than the loss of his sight ever could. Grief swallowed him whole, dragging him into a void of self-loathing and despair. The once brilliant architect became a prisoner of his own mind, trapped in the darkness of his past. For months, he refused help. Friends called, but he ignored them. His apartment grew silent, lifeless. The thought of navigating the world without Rachel, without sight, seemed unbearable. He rejected every attempt at rehabilitation, convinced that his life had ended the night of the accident. Then came Apollo. At first, Daniel didn't want the dog. The idea of depending on an animal for mobility, for safety, felt like an insult to the man he once was. But Apollo was different. He wasn't just a guide dog, he was a retired K-9 from the police force, trained not only to assist but to protect. Apollo had his own scars. He had once been a part of an elite narcotics unit, working alongside officers to track down criminals. But during a high-risk drug raid, an explosion had left him with a permanent injury to his hind leg. Though still strong and capable, he was retired from duty, deemed unfit for the high-stakes world of law enforcement. The police department, recognizing Daniel's struggles, suggested that Apollo might be the companion he needed. Reluctantly, Daniel agreed to meet him. Their first interaction was tense. Daniel sat stiffly on his couch while Apollo observed him, ears alert, tail still. Then, slowly, Apollo approached, pressing his head against Daniel's knee. The warmth, the weight, it was the first comforting touch Daniel had felt in months. Something inside him cracked. From that day on, Apollo became his anchor. He wasn't just a dog, he was Daniel's lifeline, guiding him through the darkness, both physically and emotionally. With Apollo by his side, Daniel began to reclaim fragments of his life. Yet, even with Apollo's presence, shadows of the past still lingered. Guilt over Rachel's death haunted him. Self-doubt crept in whenever he attempted something new. The world was still a dangerous place for a blind man, and Daniel often wondered if he truly had the strength to face it. But fate wasn't done testing him. Because soon, Daniel would learn that sometimes, the greatest threats don't come from darkness itself, but from the people lurking within it. Daniel had never imagined that a dog could change his life. When he first met Apollo, he had been skeptical, even resentful. The thought of relying on an animal to navigate his daily existence felt like another cruel joke from the universe. He had already lost so much, his independence, his vision, his future with Rachel. Now, he was being told that his best option was to put his trust in a creature that didn't even speak his language. Yet, as the weeks passed, something unexpected happened. Apollo wasn't just a guide dog. He wasn't like the other service animals Daniel had read about in pamphlets from the rehabilitation center. He had a presence, strong, steady, and sharp. Every movement was calculated, every action deliberate. He wasn't simply leading Daniel across streets or helping him find doorways. He was watching, sensing, protecting. It took time for Daniel to understand just how special Apollo was. One evening, as Daniel sat on the floor of his apartment, absent-mindedly stroking Apollo's fur, his fingers brushed against something rough. A scar. Curious, he traced the marks along the dog's side, realizing that there were many. Raised lines of old wounds, scars earned from battles he would never hear about. That was when Daniel truly saw Apollo for what he was. A fighter. A survivor. Apollo had once belonged to the narcotics division of the NYPD, trained to detect drugs and take down criminals. His unit had been responsible for some of the largest busts in the city, but that line of work was not without danger. During a particularly high-stakes raid on a Black Serpent's hideout, Apollo had saved his handler's life by taking down an armed suspect. In the chaos, an explosion rocked the building. The blast left Apollo with a partially injured hind leg, not enough to cripple him, but enough to warrant his early retirement from the force. Daniel didn't know whether it was fate or irony that had brought Apollo into his life. Both of them had lost something essential. Both of them were damaged in ways that the world couldn't see. Apollo was patient with Daniel in a way no person ever had been. He didn't pity him. He didn't hesitate when Daniel fumbled or lashed out in frustration. He simply waited, guided, and stayed. Their bond strengthened over time, woven together through shared experiences. The first time Daniel attempted to walk through the streets of Brooklyn without assistance from another human, Apollo was there, leading with unwavering confidence. He felt the slight pull of the harness when Apollo signaled a curb, the firm press of a body against his leg when Apollo guided him around an obstacle. Then there was the night Daniel had woken up in a panic, the weight of Rachel's absence crushing him like an avalanche. He had sat on the edge of his bed, gasping for air, hands gripping the sheets. Apollo had been there too. No barking. No whining. Just a silent presence beside him, pressing his warm body against Daniel's feet. A quiet reminder that he wasn't alone. It was moments like those that made Daniel realize Apollo wasn't just his guide dog. He was his guardian, his tether to the world, his only real connection to something that felt solid and unbreakable. Despite this, there were still things Apollo could not protect him from: the shadows of his past, the creeping doubts, the way people looked at him with either pity or disdain. And soon, Daniel would discover that even Apollo's instincts, as sharp as they were, could not stop the storm that was coming. Because fate wasn't done with them yet. The early morning sun cast long shadows over Brooklyn's busy streets as Daniel and Apollo made their way to Brooklyn Cafe. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries. To Daniel, this cafe had become a second home, a place where the world still made sense even when he couldn't see it. As they approached the familiar entrance, Apollo gently guided him around a stray chair left out by one of the baristas. A small gesture, but one that reassured Daniel in ways words never could. Inside, the hum of conversation filled the room, and Daniel easily picked out the voice of Sofia Martinez, the cafe's owner. A woman in her early 50s, she had a warm but sharp presence, a motherly figure to many in the neighborhood. She always made sure Daniel had his usual black coffee with a splash of cinnamon, just the way Rachel used to make it. "Morning, Carino," Sofia greeted, placing a steaming cup in front of him. Daniel smiled. "Morning, Sofia. Smells great in here today." Before she could respond, the deep rumble of motorcycle engines tore through the peaceful atmosphere. The noise grew louder, then stopped abruptly just outside the cafe. The sudden silence was more unsettling than the noise itself. Apollo stiffened. Daniel felt the shift in the air, a tension so thick it was almost tangible. The usual chatter died down, and he sensed heads turning toward the entrance. The door swung open with force, the old brass bell above it jingling violently. Heavy boots stomped against the wooden floor, a slow and deliberate rhythm. Even without sight, Daniel could tell the newcomers weren't just ordinary customers. Sofia muttered a quiet curse in Spanish. Then came the voice, deep, smug, laced with an authority that didn't need to be questioned. "Morning, folks." Daniel didn't need to see him to know that Vince "Viper" Morales had entered the room. Vince Morales was the kind of man whose presence made the air feel heavier. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in black leather, he was the self-proclaimed king of Brooklyn's underworld. His gang, the Black Serpents, controlled everything from protection rackets to drug distribution, and even the police hesitated to cross them. Behind him, 3 more figures followed. Jackie Jinx Coleman, a wiry woman with a cruel smirk that never left her face. She was Vince's right hand, known for manipulating and intimidating people with chilling ease. Raymond Razor Bell, a brute of a man who preferred fists over words. His knuckles were constantly bruised, a sign of how often he used them. Lucas Grant, the youngest, still unsure of his place in the gang. Unlike the others, Lucas didn't move with the same arrogant confidence. There was hesitation in his step, a reluctance buried beneath his hardened expression. The cafe remained frozen in silence as Vince approached the counter. Sophia's voice was steady, but Daniel could hear the controlled anger beneath it. "You're not welcome here, Vince." Vince chuckled. Now, Sophia. That's no way to greet old friends." Sophia crossed her arms. "I don't do business with criminals." Vince let out a dramatic sigh. "See, that's what I love about you, Sophia. Always so righteous. But righteousness doesn't keep the lights on, does it?" He tapped the counter twice, a signal Daniel recognized, a demand for payment. Sophia wasn't just being harassed. She was being shaken down. Daniel clenched his fists under the table. He had heard about businesses in the area being forced to pay protection money to the Black Serpents, but he never thought they would be bold enough to come into Brooklyn Cafe, Sophia's cafe. 1,500 by next Friday, Vince continued. "Consider it rent for keeping this place accident-free." Sophia scoffed. "You mean rent for keeping you from smashing my windows?" Vince grinned. "Semantics." Daniel could feel Apollo tense at his feet. The dog could sense his frustration, his growing anger at being unable to do anything. Then came the moment that changed everything. "Hey, blind guy," Vince called out suddenly. The room went even quieter. Daniel's breath slowed. He didn't react. He wouldn't give Vince the satisfaction. But Vince wasn't done. His boots thudded against the floor as he walked toward Daniel. Apollo's low growl rumbled beneath the table. "That's a big dog you've got there," Vince mused, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. Daniel didn't respond. He focused on his breathing, on the subtle shifts in Apollo's posture. Vince snapped his fingers. "You know, my buddy Razor here is real good with dogs. Isn't that right, Razor?" Razor chuckled darkly. "Oh yeah. Love, M." And then, the sharp, sickening sound of a boot connecting with flesh. Apollo yelped. Daniel's world snapped into focus in an instant. Before he could even process what happened, a blur of fur and muscle lunged forward. Apollo wasn't just a guide dog. He was a trained K9, a soldier, a protector. And right now, he was ready to kill. The entire cafe erupted into chaos. Jackie swore and grabbed for something in her jacket, a knife, a gun, Daniel couldn't tell. Lucas stepped back, uncertainty flashing across his face. Vince, to his credit, didn't move. He simply watched as Apollo stood his ground, muscles coiled, teeth bared, a deep and menacing growl vibrating in his throat. The entire gang knew the truth in that moment. One wrong move, and Apollo would rip them apart. Vince clicked his tongue. Well, looks like the blind guy's got some fight in him after all. He let the moment hang in the air before chuckling. "All right. We'll be back, Sophia. But next time, I expect a little more hospitality." He whistled, signaling his crew to leave. As they strode out, Daniel released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Apollo remained locked in place, his entire body still on high alert. Sophia knelt beside him, checking for injuries. "He's okay," she assured Daniel. "Just a bruise." Daniel's fists tightened. They would come back. And next time, they might not be so willing to walk away. The cafe remained eerily silent long after Vince and his crew had walked out the door. The tension still hung in the air, thick like smoke, leaving everyone in the room rattled. Daniel could feel it in the way the customers whispered among themselves, in the nervous shuffle of feet, in the heavy sigh that escaped from Sofia Martinez as she knelt beside Apollo. Daniel tightened his grip around his cane. He wanted to ask if Apollo was hurt, but he already knew the answer. The sound of the kick still echoed in his mind, the sharp impact of boot against flesh. Apollo had stood his ground, but the hit must have hurt. "He's okay," Sofia finally murmured, her voice soft yet firm. "Bruised, but nothing broken." Daniel released the breath he had been holding. His hand instinctively reached down, fingers brushing against the thick fur of Apollo's neck. The dog leaned into the touch, a silent reassurance that he was still ready, still watching, still there. The scrape of a chair against the floor broke the silence. Someone was leaving in a hurry, muttering about how this part of town was going to hell. Sofia let out a low curse. "They're getting bolder," she muttered under her breath. Daniel nodded slowly. "How long has this been going on?" There was hesitation before she answered. "They've been shaking down businesses in the neighborhood for months. At first, they just hovered around, making their presence known. But then, they started demanding money. Some people paid to keep them away. Others tried to fight back. Daniel didn't need to ask what happened to those who resisted. He could hear it in the edge of her voice. "They came for me a few weeks ago," she continued. "I refused. Thought I could handle it. But then, one of my suppliers backed out of a deal overnight. Said they didn't want trouble. Then my window got smashed. Then this." She gestured toward the cafe, toward the fear that still lingered in the air. Daniel swallowed hard. He had no doubt that Vince would be back. The way he spoke, the way he had lingered, it wasn't just about money. It was about control. About sending a message. He clenched his jaw. They thought they could do whatever they wanted because no one would stop them. But they had underestimated Apollo. And him. That night, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He sat on the edge of his bed, his mind racing with everything that had happened. Apollo rested at his feet, but Daniel could tell the dog was still alert, still on edge. It wasn't just the fact that Vince had tried to intimidate him. It wasn't just the way he mocked Daniel's blindness. It was the way he had kicked Apollo. That was what burned in Daniel's chest. They hadn't just been thugs looking for money. They had enjoyed the power they held over people, the fear they created. Daniel had spent years living in the shadows, trying to keep his world small, safe. But he knew, deep down, this wasn't something he could ignore. Because they wouldn't ignore him. The next day, Daniel was back at Brooklyn Cafe. He sat at his usual spot, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, trying to focus on anything other than the unease crawling beneath his skin. The cafe was quieter than usual, customers hesitant, wary, waiting to see if trouble would return. Sofia had stayed behind the counter most of the morning, checking the door every time the bell rang. Then it happened. The roar of motorcycles. Daniel felt it before he heard it, the low vibrations against the floor, the way the air seemed to shift with tension. Apollo's ears pricked up, his body stiffening. Then the door swung open with force, and the world seemed to stop. Vince had returned. "Miss me?" Daniel felt the change in Apollo immediately. The dog lowered himself slightly, shifting his weight onto his haunches, muscles coiled like a spring, ready to act. Daniel gripped his cane, steadying himself. "Didn't think I'd be back so soon?" Vince continued, his voice dripping with amusement. "See, I figured you needed some time to reconsider my proposal." Sofia's voice was steady, but there was an edge of fury beneath it. "I already gave you my answer, Vince. It's not changing." A chair scraped against the floor, and Daniel sensed movement behind him, someone shifting, getting up. "You sure about that?" Vince pressed. Because here's the thing. I don't like being told no. A pause. A breath. A challenge hanging in the air. You should leave. Daniel's own voice surprised him. A beat of silence, then Vince let out a low chuckle. You got some nerve, blind guy. Daniel turned his head toward him. And you've got some bad judgment. Vince made a sound of amusement. Yeah? And why's that? Daniel didn't answer. Because Apollo did it for him. A deep, guttural growl. Low. Dangerous. A promise of violence waiting to be unleashed. The cafe held its breath. That dog of yours is starting to piss me off, Vince muttered. Daniel's grip on Apollo's harness tightened. That's funny, he said evenly. Because he doesn't like you either. Vince clicked his tongue, unimpressed. You really think a dog is going to protect you forever? Daniel's voice was calm, but firm. Unyielding. You really think I need protecting? Vince exhaled sharply, his amusement fading. He took a step closer. Careful, Carter. I don't like being tested. Daniel lifted his chin slightly. Then stop picking fights you can't win. Another tense pause. And then, Vince laughed. You got a hell of a mouth for someone who doesn't even know what's happening around him. But he did know. He knew the shift in the air. The way Vince's patience was running thin. He knew Apollo could smell the anger radiating off the man. And he knew, without a doubt, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Vince took a step back. See you around, Carter. Then, just like that, he was gone. But as the door swung shut behind him, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Next time, Vince wouldn't be coming just to talk. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the city beyond his window, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing Apollo's fur. The dog hadn't relaxed since the encounter at the cafe. Even now, Apollo lay beside the bed, his body still tense, ears flicking at every distant sound. Daniel didn't need sight to know what that meant. Apollo was worried. So was he. Ever since losing his vision, Daniel had learned to trust his instincts, to rely on the small details others might overlook. The tension in Sophia's voice earlier that day, the way Vince had lingered just a second too long before leaving, none of it sat right with him. This wasn't over. And Vince would be back. The next morning, Daniel found himself waiting, for what, he wasn't sure. Trouble? A confrontation? Maybe just a sign that things wouldn't spiral further. But the tension only grew. At the cafe, Sophia was jumpy. She barely spoke as she served coffee, her hands gripping the counter a little too tightly whenever the front door jingled. Daniel could hear the whispers from the other customers. They were worried too. Some of them had already started avoiding the cafe, afraid of getting caught in the crossfire if things escalated. And Daniel could feel it, the slow unraveling of something fragile. They'll come back, Sophia muttered, setting down his coffee with more force than necessary. Daniel took a deep breath. I know. Sophia hesitated. I've been thinking about closing the place for a while. Maybe this is a sign. Daniel frowned. Sophia, this cafe is your life. And what good is it if it gets me killed? She snapped. Then, softening, she sighed. I don't know what to do, Daniel. He understood. It was the same helplessness he had felt after the accident, after Rachel died. That overwhelming feeling that no matter what he did, he was powerless. That wasn't a feeling he wanted to live with again. Or let anyone else live with either. That afternoon, Mark Reynolds came by. Daniel could tell it was him before he even spoke, the scent of leather and coffee, the sound of his practical, heavy footsteps. You heard, huh? Daniel murmured, not bothering to turn his head. Mark sighed as he took a seat. Heard? I had to break up a fight between two shop owners last night because one of them wanted to give in to the black serpents and the other refused. They're pushing harder, Daniel. Daniel's jaw tightened. And what's being done about it? Mark hesitated. That was all Daniel needed to know. Damn it, he muttered. You think I don't want to take them down? Mark's voice was low, tense. You think I don't see what they're doing? But we need more than complaints and broken windows. We need solid evidence. Daniel exhaled slowly. So until then, we're just supposed to wait? Mark didn't answer. Because they both knew the truth. Waiting wasn't an option. That night, the unease only grew. Daniel sat on the couch, Apollo curled beside him, but neither of them could relax. Outside, the street was quiet. Too quiet. Then, footsteps. Slow. Measured. Close. Apollo's head snapped up, ears alert. Daniel held his breath, focusing on the sounds outside. A car engine idling a little too long. The distinct scrape of boots on pavement. Then, nothing. Whoever it was, they were watching. Daniel reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over Mark's contact. But before he could call, the footsteps retreated. The car drove off. Daniel exhaled, feeling the tension in his chest loosen just slightly. But he knew the truth. This was just the beginning. The clock on Daniel's nightstand read 2:47 a.m. when Apollo's low growl rumbled through the silence. Daniel's eyes snapped open. His heart pounded in his chest as he lay still, listening, his entire body on high alert. Apollo was never wrong about these things. His growl wasn't the restless kind he sometimes made when dreaming, it was a warning. Something was very wrong. Daniel reached down, feeling the tense muscles beneath Apollo's thick fur. The dog was already standing, his body rigid, ears pricked forward, listening. Then, a sound. A faint shuffle. A scrape against glass. Daniel's breath hitched. The window. Someone was outside. He sat up slowly, gripping the edge of his bed. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with the weight of impending danger. Then, a soft metallic click. Daniel's stomach dropped. That was a lock being tampered with. The realization sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. His fingers found his cane, gripping it tightly as he listened, waited, assessed. Apollo let out a deep, controlled snarl. Daniel reached for his phone, trying to keep his movements silent. Another click. Then, a soft creak, the window was opening. Daniel's hands shook as he unlocked his phone and called Mark. The ringing felt like it lasted forever. Then, a groggy voice. Daniel? What's? They're here, Daniel whispered, keeping his voice low, controlled. Mark was instantly awake. Stay put. I'm on my way. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He stayed still, breathing slow, feeling the minutes stretch painfully. Then, a thud. Footsteps. Inside the apartment. Daniel knew his apartment well, every inch of it, every creaky floorboard, every shadowed corner. The intruder didn't. That gave him an advantage. The footsteps were slow, careful. Whoever it was, they were trying to be quiet. But Apollo wasn't having it. The dog lunged forward, letting out a snarl so vicious it made Daniel's own skin prickle. A curse. A scramble of movement. The sharp clatter of a chair being knocked over. The intruder hadn't expected a trained K9. Daniel could feel Apollo's body tensed beside him, ready to attack. He held onto the harness, keeping him from lunging just yet. Easy, boy, Daniel murmured, voice steady despite his racing heart. He heard the intruder pause. A breath. A hesitation. Then, another voice. Stand down, mutt. Daniel froze. That voice. He knew it. Vince. Of course it was Vince. The realization sent a cold rage through him. Daniel gritted his teeth. Didn't take you long. Vince chuckled darkly. Figured I'd pay you a visit. You know, since you've been so friendly lately. Daniel's fingers tightened around Apollo's harness. Breaking and entering isn't exactly what I'd call friendly. A low chuckle. Who said anything about breaking? Then, another set of footsteps. More than one intruder. Daniel's pulse spiked. Vince wasn't alone. You're making a mistake, Daniel said, keeping his voice calm even as his mind raced. Vince scoffed. Oh yeah? And why's that? Daniel took a slow breath. Because you have no idea what you've walked into. A pause. Then, a click. Daniel didn't need sight to recognize that sound. A gun. Apollo snarled, his muscles bunching like a coiled spring. Vince let out an amused hum. Relax, Carter. No one needs to get hurt. Daniel didn't believe that for a second. They hadn't broken into his apartment in the middle of the night to have a chat. They were here to send a message. Vince took a slow step forward. Here's how this is gonna go. You're gonna keep your dog on a leash, you're gonna tell your cop buddy to back off, and you're gonna mind your own damn business. Daniel held his ground. And if I don't? Another click. The barrel of a gun was now pointed at him. Daniel's grip on Apollo tightened. He could hear Vince's breathing, the faint rustle of fabric as he adjusted his stance. He was close. Apollo felt it too. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the dog's chest. Then, the distant sound of sirens. Vince swore under his breath. Mark was close. The intruders panicked. Let's go, someone hissed. Vince hesitated for a fraction of a second, then cursed again. Daniel heard the scramble of footsteps, the sound of the window being yanked open. Then, silence. Apollo remained rigid, still growling softly, ears trained on the now empty space. Daniel sat there, heart pounding, listening to the chaos retreat. A moment later, the front door burst open. Daniel. Mark's voice. Apollo relaxed slightly, his tail wagging just once in recognition. Daniel let out a slow breath. I'm fine. Mark was already moving, clearing the apartment, gun drawn. They got out through the window, Daniel murmured. Mark swore. Cowards. Daniel exhaled slowly, gripping Apollo's harness for stability as he stood. His body still trembled with adrenaline, but his mind was clear. Mark ran a frustrated hand through his hair. You need to leave town, at least for a while. They're getting desperate. Daniel shook his head. No. Mark turned. Daniel, be serious. These guys aren't playing around. I know, Daniel said, steady, unwavering. Mark studied him for a long moment. Then, he sighed. All right, he muttered. Then we take this fight to them. Lucas Grant had always known he was in too deep. He had joined the Black Serpents thinking it would give him something, a purpose, a place to belong, a family. But what he got instead was a never-ending cycle of violence, fear, and orders he didn't want to follow. He wasn't like Vince or Razor. He didn't have the same hunger for control, for power. He had convinced himself for months that he was just doing what he had to do to survive. But tonight? Tonight was different. Lucas sat on his motorcycle, parked just a block away from Daniel Carter's apartment, his stomach twisting with unease. He had watched as Vince and Razor broke in, knowing full well what was about to happen. And yet, he had done nothing. His fingers tightened around the handlebars as the seconds dragged on. Then, sirens. Lucas's head snapped up. Shit. The flashing red and blue lights rounded the corner, illuminating the dark street. A moment later, Vince and Razor came scrambling out of the apartment, swearing as they ran toward their bikes. Move, move. Vince barked, his voice sharp with frustration. Lucas hesitated for half a second before instinct kicked in. He revved his engine and followed them, the three of them tearing down the street, weaving between cars and disappearing into the city's underbelly. But the entire time, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. That this was the moment he had to decide who he really was. The gang reconvened at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place the Black Serpents often used as a meeting point when things got too hot. Vince paced in front of his bike, seething. Cops were too damn fast, he muttered. Somebody tipped them off. Lucas kept his expression neutral, even as his mind raced. He knew exactly who had tipped them off. Daniel Carter. The blind man. The one they had tried to intimidate but who had stood his ground anyway. Lucas had spent the last few weeks watching Carter from the sidelines, listening to the way Vince talked about him, mocking his blindness, calling him weak. But Lucas had seen something different. He had seen a man who refused to be afraid. A man who, despite his circumstances, had more courage than anyone in this room. Vince ran a hand through his hair, breathing heavily. "We're not done," he growled. "Carter and that dog? They need to learn their place." Lucas's stomach dropped. "I say we go back," Razor suggested, still rubbing his arm where Apollo had bit him. "This time, we don't play nice." Vince nodded. "We finish this." Lucas's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't let that happen. Not anymore. Later that night, Lucas made a decision that would change everything. He left the warehouse, riding through the city streets with his heart pounding. Every instinct told him to turn back, to play it safe, to keep pretending he was just another loyal member of the gang. But he didn't. Instead, he found himself outside Brooklyn Cafe, staring at the darkened windows, wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. With a deep breath, he walked up to the door and knocked. Daniel didn't expect visitors, especially not at 3 a.m. He was still wired from the break-in, sitting on the couch with Apollo stretched out beside him, keeping watch. So when the knock came, both of them reacted instantly. Apollo shot up, his body tense, ears pinned forward. Daniel grabbed his cane, his heart hammering. "Who is it?" A pause. Then, "It's Lucas." Daniel's grip on his cane tightened. He recognized the voice. One of Vince's men. Apollo let out a low warning growl, pacing by the door. Daniel took a slow breath. "What do you want?" Another pause. Then, something Daniel didn't expect. "I want to talk." Daniel hesitated. Could this be a trap? A setup? Apollo remained stiff, his instincts screaming that this was dangerous. But there was something in Lucas's voice. Something that felt different. Carefully, Daniel unlocked the door. Apollo moved forward first, positioning himself between Daniel and the doorway as a living shield. When the door opened, Lucas stood there, hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. He looked different than the others, younger, less sure of himself. Like a man caught between two lives. "I don't want trouble," Lucas said quickly. Daniel kept his expression neutral. "Then why are you here?" Lucas swallowed hard. "Because I think I've made a mistake." They sat at the small table inside the cafe, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. Lucas shifted in his seat, uneasy beneath Apollo's intense gaze. "I didn't sign up for this," he said finally. I don't know. I thought the Serpents were just a brotherhood, you know? A crew. But it's not just that." Daniel didn't say anything. He just listened. Lucas exhaled sharply. "Vince is planning to come after you. Again. And this time, he's not going to just scare you." Daniel's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he asked the one question that mattered. "And what do you want, Lucas?" Lucas looked away, struggling for words. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know I don't want to be part of this anymore." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then finally spoke. Then help me. Lucas's head snapped up. What? You don't want to be one of them? Daniel said. Then help me stop them. Lucas swallowed, visibly conflicted. You don't get it. If I betray them, I'm dead. Daniel didn't flinch. Then make it worth it. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. He was on the edge of a decision that would change his life forever. And Daniel could only hope he made the right one. Lucas sat in Mark Reynolds' office, his knee bouncing restlessly as he stared at the floor. The walls around him were lined with case files, stacks of reports that told stories of crime, corruption, and men like Vince Morales who had ruled the streets for far too long. He was about to add another chapter to that story. Daniel sat across from him, calm, steady, Apollo lying at his feet like a silent guardian. Mark leaned against his desk, arms crossed, studying Lucas carefully. You understand what you're doing, right? Mark finally said. Lucas nodded, though his throat felt dry. I do. You're giving us everything: names, locations, drug operations, the protection racket. That means you'll be testifying. Lucas exhaled sharply. I know. And once Vince finds out, he won't stop until you're dead, Mark continued, his voice grim. You're turning on the only family you've ever had. Lucas swallowed hard. They were never really my family. Daniel finally spoke. Then let's make sure they can't hurt anyone else. The raid came 3 nights later. Mark and his team moved fast, using the intel Lucas had provided. The warehouse. The stash houses. The list of corrupt cops keeping Vince protected. Everything came crashing down. Dozens of officers swarmed the Black Serpent's headquarters, taking them by surprise. Razor barely had time to reach for his gun before he was slammed against a car hood, handcuffs locking around his wrists. Vince? He tried to run. But Lucas was already there, standing at the alley's entrance, gun pointed at the ground but ready. Vince sneered, realization dawning. You? Lucas nodded. Vince laughed, shaking his head in disgust. You little. A cop tackled him from behind, cutting his words short. And just like that, the reign of the Black Serpents was over. Lucas sat on the courthouse steps the next morning, staring at the sunrise. Daniel sat beside him. Apollo too. Lucas sighed. I'm probably going to have to leave town. Daniel nodded. Yeah. But you're free now. Lucas smiled, a real one this time. Yeah. I am. The world outside Brooklyn Cafe felt different that morning. The air was crisp, the city waking up in its usual chaotic rhythm. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel Carter didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt like he had won. The Black Serpents were finished. Vince and his crew were behind bars. Businesses that had been living in fear were finally free. Justice had been served. And Daniel had helped make it happen. He sat at his usual table, Apollo at his feet, his fingers wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. Sophia placed a hand on his shoulder as she walked by, a silent gesture of gratitude. You did good, Carino, she said softly. Daniel smiled. He wasn't sure he had ever believed that before. For so long, he had let his blindness define him. He had believed that because he couldn't see, he was weak, that he was just a victim in someone else's story. But that wasn't true. He had stood his ground. He had fought back. And now, he knew that he was stronger than he had ever given himself credit for. His fingers drifted to his jacket pocket, where he had tucked away a letter he had avoided reading for years. Rachel's letter. He unfolded it carefully, feeling the edges of the worn paper. He took a breath, then ran his fingers over the Braille translation he had never been brave enough to read. My love. If you're reading this, I need you to know something I hope you'll never forget. You are stronger than you think. You always have been. Don't let this world make you feel small. Don't let your darkness define you. You are light, Daniel. And you always will be. His chest tightened. For so long, he had lived in the shadow of what he had lost. But now, he was ready to live for what he still had. He folded the letter and smiled, reaching down to scratch Apollo's ears. "Let's go, buddy." And with new purpose, Daniel stood up, ready for whatever came next.